Whether you are new to photography, you've just bought a new camera, you've been shooting for a while, and you're still trying to get your heads around it, this video is for you. Today we're going to break down the 3 basic tools of controlling and manipulating your exposure, the creative sides of using those tools and why you would choose one over the other, how they all work together, all that sort of thing. Basically, it's the video I wished that was there for me when I first started. That's what I'm trying to give to you. So yeah, let's get on with it. Done. So let's get into things. Before we start, I just want to let you know that this will be a fully camera agnostic video. I'm not talking about specific brands. I'm not going to show you different features. I'm not going to show you how to find these tools in your camera. That's up to you. Every camera is a little bit different, but it is a fact that these 3 basic tools have been used in every image that has ever been created. They will be used in every image you ever create, whether you grasp them and control them or let the camera you do it itself. They will be there in everything. They are vitally important to understand when it comes to being creative with your imagery rather than just capturing a snapshot. So with that all said, the last thing to say is that I'm going to break this down into 2 parts. The first part, I'm going to explain what the 3 tools are and how they work. And then I'm going to explain with the second part what the creative side, the secondary effect of these 3 tools are. So getting into it, the first of the 3 tools is your aperture. And the aperture is pretty easy to understand when you think about it. You have a lens. It's got glass at the front, glass at the end. There may be multiple pieces of glass in the middle, and there's a barrel. There's the body of the lens. Somewhere in there is an aperture. And what it is, it's a hole. It's a hole from the front to the back that allows light to go through. You can control this hole. You can make it bigger and you can make it smaller. If you make it bigger, then more light can come pouring through that and into the camera to create your image. If you reduce the size of that hole, of course, it's restricting the flow of light. Less light can get through. And so you can control this to control your exposure. If your image is coming out too dark, you open up the aperture, allow more light to come pouring through, you get a brighter image. If your image is too bright to start with, then you close that down, less light comes pouring through, and you have a darker image. That's pretty much it. Like I said, very, very simple to understand when you've got it. The numbers are what confuse people. The settings are what confuse people. The concept is easy to understand. So here is just your little tip. The numbers are backwards from what you think they are. We call them f-stops. It doesn't matter why. There's a historical reason. It's irrelevant. In practice, in purpose, you don't need to know why. But you do need to know that f22 is a small, tiny little hole, and f1.4 is a big hole. And the numbers in between, they follow that same pattern. f16 is smaller than f8. F8 is smaller than F4, etc. It's the inverse. You would think that the bigger the hole, the bigger the number would be. No, it's the other way around. We choose the numbers based on a number of different factors when we're shooting. Like I said, there's a secondary aspect, but the primary purpose is to control that flow of light through, to adjust your exposure, to get the image looking the way that you want it to. Now, the secondary one is very, very similar. It operates on a similar kind of principle, but the aperture works on diameter. It's the size of the opening, the size that allows the light to flow through. The secondary thing is, or secondary tool, it's called shutter speed. And it works in a similar but different way. Instead of opening or working on size, it works on time. Think of it as being a door. It's a door that stands behind the lens before the camera. The camera can't see any light till that door opens. And the amount of time that door is open, that's how much light can come pouring through. So you can imagine that if the door is open for a very, very long time, lots of light comes pouring through. And if it only quickly opens and shuts, only a little bit can get through in that period of time. Similar concept, like I said, it's controlling the flow of light, but it's on the time axis, not on the size axis. Again, the numbers are what confuse people. We use a fraction-based system. It's based on time, starting off with 1 second. 1 is 1 second, and you can get bigger. depending what you're doing, but most people are shooting below 1 second, and so we're using fractions. 1/30 is slightly slower, faster than 1 second. 1/60 is faster than 1/30. 1/100 is getting pretty fast indeed. Then you can start moving up to 1/200, 1/500. Then you're talking about probably using flashes or strobes. You can go all the way up to things like 1/8000. You would need a lot of light for that sort of scenario. Like I said, with the other one, with the Aperture, there is a secondary effect, a creative effect. We'll get into that in the second half. The third tool is called ISO. And it's a tricky one for me to explain to you, because with the first one, I could talk about it being the flow of light and the size. And with the second, I could talk about it being time, how fast it's open. The ISO, it's a tricky one to explain. It's based on the way that film used to work, and yeah, there's no real paradigm, there's no real analogy that I can give you. It's basically how sensitive the camera is to light. The less sensitive it is, the more light is needed to get the camera to react. The more sensitive it is, the less light is required to get the camera to react. I can't put it any simpler or any easier than that, except to say that the numbers make sense with ISO. It's going to start at 50. Your camera may only go down to 100, but it pretty much starts at 50, and then you can work your way up from there. The bigger the number is, the more sensitive your camera is. So just like the other two, you can adjust things. If your image is coming out too dark, you can increase your ISO number. It's maybe set at 100, move it up to 150, move it up to 200, more sensitivity, not more flow of light. It just reacts better to the light, and you can get a brighter picture. If you are trying to go the other way, often you find yourself blocked. There's no way to go. If your camera starts at 100 and you need to make your image darker, you can't move it any further down. But if your ISO is set at 400, then you could move it down a little bit. So it depends where things are set with your camera on the image that you're trying to take. Now, these three things work in combination. They work together. One is controlling the amount via diameter, one via time, and one via sensitivity. And the three are a triangle. They fit together perfectly because there are different ways that you can control the exposure so that you can get different types of images in different situations. This is leading into the second part, but I do want to make sure that you're aware. This is something I think a lot of people at the beginning don't immediately grasp. It makes sense once you know what you're doing, but it takes a while to understand this. You can take 20 pictures of the same exact scene in the same exact conditions, and they are all equally exposed. They're all the equivalent of each other. They all have a proper, correct exposure. But each picture could look vastly and wildly different and feel different than the other because of the way the settings are. If you increase, we'll tell you what, hold on a second. Let's get into the secondary effects, and then this will all make a lot more sense. We're gonna run through those three things again. We're going to give you what the secondary effects are, and we're going to start with, of course, Aperture. That's where we started before. That's where we are now. Aperture, like I said, is controlling the flow of light via the diameter of the opening, the size of the hole in the lens. A weird side effect of that we can harness and control creatively is what that does to the image. There's a concept out there. It's basic concept that's used in photography. It's called the depth of field. And it basically means the distance that things are in focus from the camera or from the focal point of the camera to where it stops being in focus. I wanted to explain this. If you want to have your mountains and your farmhouse and your people and the sheep all in focus, you want a very, very wide depth of focus. You want it to go all the way back and all the way forward. You're going to focus somewhere in the middle because it's going to have a depth of field around it, how far that goes. If you want to take a picture of a beautiful person out in the woods someday, and you want the background to be all blurry and soft, maybe a few little highlights that are sparkling and making little round circles. You want it to look beautiful, and you don't want them to be the image to be distracting from the subject, the person you're taking a picture of. You want a very shallow depth of field. You want them to be in focus, but anything beyond them or anything in front of them has got to fall out of focus. It's got to move into a blur. And so it's got to be a very, very small depth of field. We control depth of field by controlling our aperture. Like I said, it's a side effect of the size of that hole. The bigger that hole is, the smaller the number, the less depth of field you're going to get. The smaller the number, the bigger the depth of field. So creatively, just like we chose different apertures to adjust our exposure, creatively, we're choosing different apertures to create the image that we want. If I want to take a picture of a coffee cup on a table with a kitchen behind me, if I use a very, very small aperture, that entire kitchen is going to be in focus. It may be messy. There might be lots of garbage going on. I want to blur that out. I just want that coffee cup to be nice and sharp and in focus. And I want things to start to become less distracting in the background. I'm going to choose a larger aperture for that, but not so large that the front or the back of my coffee cup fall out of focus. I need it to be just big enough for that and everything I want in focus, and then small enough to throw the back into blur. If I, however, want to take a picture of a full room and I want all the details to be there, I want it to be crisp and sharp as much as possible from front to back, I'm going to choose a much smaller aperture, and I'm probably going to need to either adjust something else to make the exposure work or bring in extra lights, which is a whole different video when we talk about lighting. So we don't get into that today. And like I said, that is pretty much the secondary effect. You can use aperture to control exposure, but you can also use it to control the look and feel of your image. Same thing goes for your shutter speed. Your shutter speed, as I mentioned before, it's a door. It's how long that door is open. It's operating on time. It's capturing everything that's happening in front of it while that door is open. And then as soon as it closed, you're not seeing anything. It's not capturing any more information. So things happen over time. Time doesn't just stop because you click a button. Things move. And if they're moving while that door is open, your camera is going to capture that movement. So you may find yourself frustrated. You may find yourself with blurry images. It's because you're moving around a little bit, either moving the camera or the subject is moving and it's blurry. You want to capture it. You want to freeze that moment in time. You need to go for a much faster shutter speed so less motion can happen while that shutter is open. On the other hand, you may want to impart a feeling, a general concept of motion. I'm thinking moving cars or light trails, cars moving down the highway, certain specific sport moves. Sport tends to use a faster shutter speed, but you might want to have a little bit of blur. Someone's running and you want a little bit of blur behind them. Again, a slightly slower shutter speed will help you achieve that sort of thing. More commonly in landscape photography and art photography, flowing water is a big thing. You want to use a longer shutter speed. The nice thing about it is if your camera is set locked onto a tripod so it can't move, your rocks, they don't move. Your trees, if it's not too windy, they don't move. Everything is crystal sharp, but your water continues to flow constantly. So if you open up your shutter speed, capturing more time, that flow of water becomes softer, it becomes smoother and silkier. You might have a lake that has slight ripples, but if you have a long shutter speed, it will look like a constant field of glass because it all sort of evens out over time. It's a very, very creative tool to use. Like I said before, just as with Aperture, we have a way to use it to control our exposure. We also have a way to use it to creatively affect the image that we're creating. And just like before, ISO is the odd man out. Aperture controls the flow, Shutter speed controls the flow. Both of them are controlling how much light is getting through. ISO is controlling the sensitivity of the camera. And I'm sad to say there is no real creative positive. There's no real creative effect to ISO. There is only a slight downside. And the downside is simply this. Okay, I'm not going to get into how ISO works or why it works. All you need to know is that it's basically, it's kind of not real. It works, but it's not real. It's amplifying the signal. And when it amplifies the signal, it increases noise. Just like turning up a stereo amplifier with nothing plugged into it, it's just going to go shh, just noise in the background. Same thing happens with ISO on your camera. So if your base ISO is 100 and the settings are correct and your situation is great, you will have a nice clean image. If you have to crank it up a little bit to get that proper exposure, choosing a creative choice with your shutter speed or your aperture, then feel free, do so. Turn it up a little bit. Just be aware that the more you increase the ISO, the more the tendency for noise to occur in your imagery. And where noise will occur the most is in the darker parts of the frame. Wherever it's dark or black, there's more tendency for noise to occur there. Whereas, say on my head here, the bright spots, noise would be much less likely to at least be visible. It may occur, but you wouldn't even notice it in that area. Like I said, no real positive effect, but that slight negative effect. With that said, don't be afraid to play with ISO to get the proper exposure for your image. If you don't have lighting, if you're not using accessory tools to adjust your situation, if you're stuck with the 3 basic tools that you have in your camera, maybe you need a wide aperture, maybe you need a long shutter speed, and maybe you're still not getting the image, it's too dark, you need to increase that ISO. Yeah, don't be afraid of that. Do be judicious, do look at your images close up into them just to see how much light is, and maybe rethink a different time, opening a door, allowing a window to let some light in if your image becomes a little bit unusable. But a little bit of noise is not the end of the world as long as you've created the artwork that you truly want to do. So that's the 3 basic tools. Like I said, every image that has ever been created in a camera or a video camera is using these 3 tools. And the creative side of them is why you want to grasp it yourself. A lot of people start off with an automatic camera, and that's basically your camera has got a little algorithm, it's got a little chip in there, and it wants to make everything just right. And it will adjust things. It will adjust these 3 settings to try and get what it thinks, what it's been programmed to think is a perfect exposure. It doesn't get it right most of the time. It's in optimal circumstances, it's passable. It's almost never truly artistic or creative. It's never what you really want, but it's good enough for a snapshot, a quick image for posterity. Fine, that's great. But if you want to move beyond that and craft the images, then you need to move away from that sort of automatic setting, and you want to start controlling, making deliberate choices in how your image is going to look. Last thing I want to say about this is that there are other modes, of course. There's the manual mode that allows you to control all these 3 things completely yourself. There's the automatic mode where the camera just does it for you. In between, there's halfway measures that you can take. There's special modes. There's one where you can control the aperture, camera does the rest. So you decide how big or how small that aperture is, and it's going to adjust the ISO, and it's going to adjust the shutter speed to try and get things right. Again, it can lead to issues, but in the right circumstances, it can do a great job, and it allows you to choose your depth of field deliberately, or the amount of light that's coming in deliberately. There is one where you can control the shutter speed. That's your choice. You have decided to go out and film your children or take pictures of your children. They're playing a sport game, and you want to nice, crisp, sharp images with no motion blur. You know that to get rid of motion blur, you want to be shooting at 1/60 or more. Considering you're moving and they're moving, probably 1/80, 1/100, so a fairly fast shutter speed. And you want that to be locked in. You don't want to mess with that. So you choose that in the camera in the shutter priority mode. The camera is going to adjust everything else to try and make that work. It's going to open and close the aperture. It's going to adjust the ISO to try and make sure that every picture you take is properly exposed while you are making sure that there's no motion blur whatsoever. It's a choice that you've made creatively for those images. You're a little bit in control. There is also another mode where you can set the ISO. Not very commonly used. There's not really much point in it, but it's there. But I do highly recommend that you play with these different modes. If you're new to photography, again, if you're trying to get your head around this, these are great modes for learning because you don't have to worry about all three of them together. You can focus in on one. I just want to spend today really trying to understand Aperture, how it works, what different effects I'm going to get. I'm going to take a ton of pictures of the same thing. I'm in my Aperture priority mode, so I get to choose my aperture, and it's going to take care of everything else, and I get to see what the image looks like with f1.8, f2, f4, f8. I could play with that and get to see what that works like. So these are really, really useful tools to focus in on your learning with one at a time. And don't be ashamed of using them even after you've done the learning. As I said, I already explained, there's a lot of particular situations where it is very, very useful to use them in practice. And a lot of photographers, a lot of professional photographers actually use a shutter priority speed specifically because it reduces that motion blur. There are other times when you would use an aperture priority mode. Mode. I don't know why I said mead. Slip of the tongue. I hope that this has been somewhat helpful. I hope that you now have a better understanding of the three tools that you use to create your image and how they work in combination, and more specifically, how you would choose to adjust one versus the other to get the image that you want. If your image, as I said before, if it's too bright and you need to darken it, you could reduce the size of your aperture. But if you want to maintain that soft background, that soft focus, and keep your subject isolated from the background, that's not going to work for you. You would then need to move over to your shutter speed and start playing with that. But if you're shooting handheld, you don't want to mess with it too much, then you would move to the next best thing, which would be the ISO. That's how these things work. So if you have any further questions, if I've been unclear about anything, please leave a comment below. I'm always happy to hear from you. And sometimes I think I'm being clear, but I'm not as clear as I think I could be. So yeah, I will try my very best to answer any of those that I can. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, as always, stay creative.